So calibration is an important part of any kind of modeling. How do you know that the modeling is going to represent what the fire's going to do if you don't have confidence that it's able to represent what the fire has done? And but there are times when you don't have the information to calibrate, right? You're forced to make a prediction, to plug things in and make a run without actually observing what the fire has been doing. But obviously the fire progression map from up to the point you're making the prediction is an important piece of information. And if you don't have that, you really are kind of flying blind, right? You don't know how the fire's been interpreting, if you will, the fuels and the weather from a particular station that you might think of using. And so all of these things, fuels, topography, and weather, and the fire location, have to come together to produce reasonable predictions. And so I think the analyst needs to be aware of the mechanics of how the model is working. You shouldn't assume that the fuel characteristics that are mapped by the fire are actually what's there. Getting out on the ground or getting information from the ground is pretty important. We talked about wind. Wind is a very important factor, and if the weather station that you're using doesn't have winds that are representative of the fire location, the fire might be going in the wrong direction, at least temporarily, relative to the wind records. So that's something that should guide the selection of the weather station. Look at the wind pattern, the wind rows, for example. Wind is probably the toughest one, the toughest factor to consider, because obviously a point-based record of weather changes over time is not a very good way to represent fire winds across a very large fire. For a small fire, perhaps, if the weather station is situated similarly to the fire, such as in the same canyon or something like that, you'd probably be okay. But FSPro is not going to be able to represent the highly variable wind vectors across complex topography over fairly large area. So there's a lot of judgment required there. Also, a lot of our RAW stations are fairly sheltered. The so-called 20-foot wind speed is not really measured at 20 feet above the vegetation. And so this tends to give us an underestimate in many locations of the wind speed. So it's one reason that perhaps gust speeds are a better indication of the wind influences on a given fire. It's, the ERC trends and position in the season is a very important thing to look at. Are you on a declining, increasing trend? Having a look at the ERC percentiles as they're reflected by the weather station. We're still very limited in FSPro and any kind of fire behavior analysis by the location or proximity of the weather station, and not all of them are all that representative of fires, especially very large fires. As the fire gets bigger and bigger, there probably not going to be one weather station that represents all of the facets of that fire. So it's important to use expert understanding of fire behavior to pick the weather station and be able to scrutinize whether it applies to the fire. So we rely heavily on the danger rating system for generating artificial weather sequences. Now, the way FSPro works is that for the climatology portion of the weather sequences, it generates artificial daily values of ERC. And ERC, the energy release component, is one of the outputs of the danger rating system. ERC for a particular fuel model has different characteristics, different sensitivities. For fuel model G is the one we tend to use in FSPro now. It has fuel elements of all the size classes, 1, 10, 100, and 1,000 hour. And this enables it to represent fairly long-term trends in drying and a much smoother trend and variability than you would see if you had a grass fuel model, for example, that would be jumping around based on humidity changes, during the day. So ERC for Fuel Model G is very useful for representing long-term seasonal kinds of changes, as well as daily changes due to precipitation. And so we use Fuel Model G from the National Fire Danger Rating System to characterize the seasonal trend and the daily variation in order to generate artificial weather sequences out into the future beyond the forecast. Also, is the fire, how is it spreading? Is it spreading primarily by spotting, by rolling debris, by mechanisms that are difficult to capture in modeling, right? Because all of these models depend on a lot of assumptions and they have a lot of limitations. And the only way to accommodate those limitations, assumptions, is through judgment by the analyst. The model doesn't know any more than you put into it.